Some really hard words in the gospel reading today. Hate your family, move away, give up everything, be prepared to take your cross. It's heavy language. And of course, with heavy language, we need to unpack a little bit because it's not just strictly how it appears. I remember when my grandmother was still alive, she would often talk to me about it's my cross to bear, and what it meant to her was these inconveniences of life or these hardships of life were her torture, her punishment almost that she had to bear, or that someone else had to bear. And that's not how this passage should be read at all. There's so much more going on culturally. There's so much going on contextually, language-wise. Translation is not always great. It's never 100%. So let's start to dive in a little bit to what's going on here. The very first thing we discover when we do this is that Jesus has these crowds around him. So he's surrounded by a number of people, but he turns to his disciples and he's talking to his closest inner circle. And we're not talking just necessarily the 12 named. We're talking about the people who were closest to him, followed him, had already accepted and bought in essentially to the teachings that Jesus was doing, the message that this was not going to end well, but we were part of something bigger. And that's women and men who were part of that. And he turns to them and says, you can't follow me unless you hate your parents. You hate your mother, you hate your father. And on the surface, it's exactly the opposite of everything that the gospel and the Hebrew scriptures had told us. I mean, what do you do with love your parents, the Ten Commandments, when you have hating here? It's important to remember that the opposite of love is not hate. Hate and love are very, very closely connected. The opposite of love is apathy. And that's not what Jesus is even saying in this. You're not to get rid of the love. Hate is also translated. I mean, part of the problem is English has so few words. In Greek, ancient Greek particularly, was so nuanced in how they said things that English, being a clunky language, cannot actually take it word for word and make it sense. Mostly Jesus was saying, look, we've got two paths. They're both full. One is towards enmity, opposing, disliking, turning away from. The other is love. So you have to turn away from. It's a choice you have to make. You have to turn away from your focus on your family, on your loved ones, and you have to turn to my message. Now, this is only spoken to his closest inner circles. He was not talking to everyone. And I think it's really important to keep that context because while we try to follow Jesus, we try to be there and we try to live the life that he's asking us to live. None of us today are part of his inner circle. All we can do is take inspiration and learn from what they were telling him. In that day, when Jesus was talking to them, he was talking about real imminent death and real imminent hurt that could be brought on by the state. And there are many people around the world today who are going to have that experience, not just for following Jesus, but for a whole lot of different reasons. The majority watching this video, however, are not going to have that as a firsthand experience. So we have to kind of put that in context. We're not being asked individually to walk away from everything, because Jesus had a lot of followers who were not his inner circle, who were still commissioned to do the things. So we have to kind of draw that distinction, and it's not an easy distinction, but it's a distinction to recognize that as followers, there are almost different levels, maybe, of people who followed. Doesn't mean that their faith is not as legitimate. It means that some people of faith are going to be called to different levels of response. And I think if we look at around the world and we look at aid workers and we look at people who step up and who've chosen to stand in the line of fire for whatever reason, most of us can acknowledge that's a level of calling that we haven't received. Doesn't make ours illegitimate. It just means it's not as intense. So it's kind of a way to put in pockets of what's going on here. But anyway, getting back to the story as we have it, Jesus was telling them that you have to step up. You have to choose which path you're going to go on. You can't do both. You cannot prioritize your family and do the hard things that I'm now going to be doing. You can't come with me with that. And then again, he made a reference to pick up your cross. Pick up your cross was something very, very different in the first centuries. First of all, The cross, the letter, at the time, was also considered the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet. Tav. There was a tradition in the Hebrew, well, not even a tradition, a practice in the Hebrew culture of marking the tav on someone's forehead. It's kind of the precursor to our cross on Ash Wednesday. The mark symbolized the end, the final sign that you were identified, because the tav was the last letter in the alphabet. Now, it's not the last letter in the Greek alphabet. There's I think 4, 5, 6 letters that follow. But the essence in Hebrew culture was that you were that it stopped with you now. You were the one that was going to finalize what was going on. So there's a connection to that. Take up your cross also means being marked with the tav, the sign, the seal of completion. Add to that the fact that the Roman number one death and destruction mechanism for anybody who stood up against the government was crucifixion. Most painful, most humiliating, most difficult death that the Romans could have given. In fact, it was so difficult that by definition, Roman citizens could not be crucified. So one of the reasons it was important to identify Paul as Roman. He could be killed in a number of different ways, but he could not be crucified because he was a Roman citizen. This was saved for people who were trying to threaten the state. The Hebrews never accepted Roman governance. Never. They were always rebelling. That's one of the reasons the temple is destroyed and Jerusalem is cleared out in the year 70, is because Rome is finally done with all of the rebellions coming. And Jesus was symbolic of yet one more rebellion that they were having to deal with. Now, 70, by that time, an entire generation, at least one had gone past, probably two after Jesus had died. But it was still the same essence that we are fighting this. So you have the cultural expectation of the Tav, you have the torture device of the Romans, and we have the Greeks talking about this taking up your cross business. Now, the Christian church, first of all, didn't exist at this point in time. These are just Jesus followers. And it wasn't until the second century that people who are Jesus followers adopted the cross as their symbol. So this in no way is about taking up the physical cross of Jesus. That's not on the concept. This is not about putting yourself on a road to certain death. It's possible. Certainly many died, but that wasn't necessarily what was intended. The people who were called to this intense level of following and change had to do so and risk everything they were in order to follow Jesus' message. And that was essentially what Jesus was talking about. When we, as regular followers, and I hate to actually distinguish that, but those of us who are not called to that level of intensity, our picking up our cross is not about burden. Remember, Jesus is not a sadist. God is not a sadist. There's no punishment for us. There's no, you following me, I'm going to make it hurt. I'm going to make it painful for you. That's just not part of reality. That's not part of our faith. That's not part of our God. But it might have been the experience at a time when torture was completely accepted. What it means in our modern context is you take up your issue. You take, what do you want to change? What is it that you are passionate about? What is it about that you look at and you are enraged? There's a calling in there that demands your attention. Now, that's for those of us who are comfortable. There's other places in the world, of course, where Christians are threatened by death just by having the faith. All of us have a different perspective and a different way of kind of looking at what that cross is. For those of us primarily in North America, it is making a difference through social action. It is stepping up and saying, this is what I'm going to do. It's choosing your thing. Oftentimes, those of us who are involved with the project of social justice get caught up in so many. but this is a very singular thing. What is your thing that you are so passionate about, so ready to change, so absolutely convinced that there's a better way of doing things, so driven by your faith and your belief in God's calling you to this purpose, that you will choose that over material comfort? That's what the last verse is about. What is your thing? What are you going to stand up and change at the expense of what you own, at the risk of your family either not accepting you or completely turning their back on you? What is that thing? And that is your cross. That is your burden to bear. That is your something that you are choosing. That's just it. It's not that you're a recipient of it. You are choosing to make that your focus. That's what Jesus is asking us to be. And he's asking us to do it thoughtfully, not just kind of jump in and say, oh, homeless really bothers me. That's not the way to approach this. Jesus talked about preparing also. You don't build a house without building a foundation. You don't start a war without having enough people and enough ammunition to go about it. You don't make a project without having the resources you have. You have to make other plans if you don't have what you have. So be thoughtful. Be conscious of what it is that you are really driven by. Your cross is your action. It's your choice to make a difference the way God commissioned us and asked us to do. Pick what that is that you are going to dedicate your life to. You might be dedicating your life to something that is going to turn off everybody who loves you. And if you are passionately called by God to do that thing, that's your path. But it's your choice. That's the thing in all of this. You are not being assigned the challenge. You are being given the opportunity to pick the challenge. Pick wisely, pick thoughtfully, go through and see if you are actually the person to do this or if you're just one of the minions, essentially, who are going to be part of bringing it together. You're not necessarily going to be the one who is called to give up life. Some have, many have, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be willing to give up your life to be called. There's a connection, there's not a correlation. Choose your thing. That is your cross. That is what you are willing to put your life towards, what you are willing to have marked as your completion. This is your ultimate movement, your ultimate goal, your ultimate way of deciding how you're going to live out your faith. Hard words, thoughtful words. Do not run off without having thought through it, because Jesus knew that it's not easy. It's not glib. It's not a choice that we can make in the moment. It is something we have to really spend time thinking of it. Is this where God wants me to be? And am I prepared to go there and to follow God's lead? Because it might not end well.